Hey, welcome back, everybody, to Smarter You Media, where we're crazy enough to tell you that we'll make you smarter in 2 minutes. We're super excited today to have Hans Hansen, Dr. Hans Hansen, who is a distinguished associate professor at Rawls College of Business, has taught all over the world, and is going to share some of his wisdom on a bunch of things. I'm super excited to have you here. Hans, welcome to Smarter You Media.
Thanks for having me.
So, we don't mess around. We get straight to it. We understand life is super busy. So, we go straight into that, making you smarter. And if people want to stick around, they can. We have our fabulous chicken timer who is ready. And I will put 2 minutes. You can hear it coming. That's one. That's two. Hans, make us just a little bit smarter.
All right, Steve. Well, I want to start by saying today we think in narrative terms, all of us. We go by narratives all the time when we make decisions, when we navigate any situation. So, in fact, none of us have ever made a decision or determined a course of action or made some sense of someone else's behavior without going by a narrative, meaning something is always guiding our decisions. Here's the opportunity. Mostly, we are largely unconscious about this process, but we can be intentional about creating the narratives that guide us. And for organizations, it's like a strategy on steroids. It
Yeah.
entails everything a strategy does, as well as a detailed implementation plan. It's a story of how our vision is going to come to fruition, through what actions that is. And if all of the stakeholders in a company co-create a narrative, we are literally on the same page. We're highly committed and highly coordinated. It is even more poignant for family businesses and than other organizations because of a unique advantage that narratives have over strategies. Narratives can hold many diverse aims and goals and still move the plot forward. It doesn't have to resolve these tensions. It draws on tensions. And something distinct about a family business is that they have multiple goals. So we should all create the narratives that we go by.
Oh, that's awesome. And you know what? That was less than 2 minutes. See, we've guaranteed it with 30 seconds left. We're already far along for the day. I love that you started with that. I was so hoping you would go to the narratives page, but gave you free reign to start wherever you wanted to start. You want to give the title of your book so that we can have that in our minds as we start? Because you wrote
Sure.
an entire narrative, and maybe tell a little bit about the underpinning circumstances that brought you to write that book.
It's called Narrative Change, and it's how changing the story can transform society, business, and ourselves. And the intractable change, really a transformational change that the book tells about, is how a small group of people changed how the death penalty operates in Texas by creating a narrative. So I worked with Texas's first permanent death penalty defense team, which means in 246 of Texas's 254 counties, we're the defense for capital murder cases. And in the past, the state would win almost 90% of the time in trials in Texas.
Yeah.
And it was because it was really weighted towards the prosecution. So we changed how defense happened and we changed the outcomes. And in my time with the team, we were 70-1 of stopping the death penalty. And it wasn't that hard, which
Well,
is really a frightening thought because
yeah.
we could ask, Texas has a reputation for the death penalty and having cases overturned. So death penalty defense was just not in great shape. But this small team, starting right in Lubbock, Texas, went by a narrative and changed the way things were done by enacting that narrative, which any company could do. And that's what I want to talk to you about next.
Well, I love that. And, it's not just companies, it's all humans, right? So, I mean, this is applicable to each and every one of us every day because whether we know it or not, we are living our lives and moving forward every day based on story and narrative that oftentimes we're not even aware of. Correct?
That's correct. We're not conscious of like why I should go to college and get a job here. It's because the story of it, that's what it takes to get successful. So we often go by these narratives, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. That's one we're all familiar with, and it teaches us not to lie. But a story about a child being torn apart by wolves is much more memorable Narratives are more
Yeah.
memorable and
Oh,
lasting than a bullet point list or goals like don't lie, don't do this. To hear it in a story really locks it in. And the same thing can happen when we're planning forward. So that's the real difference in creating a narrative, is that we have a bunch that we go by all the time, but we can actually create one. And then if we manage to enact that narrative, that change will come about.
well, I think your story is a powerful story of hope because it feels so often like things around us are so entrenched, or there's no place, no way that I or we can make something different. And it's amazing how we do it all the time. But that's the foundation. Sometimes we just don't feel like there's a way.
Incredible change, intractable change, transformational change always starts with a small group of people.
Every time, all the time. And if you think about one of the great books that I enjoy is a book called Sapiens, which you may or may not have run into, by Yuval Harari. And it is essentially looking at history and how humans interact. Apparently, about 150 people, we can live in a community and with gossip and various things have a community. Beyond that, if we don't have story to bind us together, if we don't have the things that eventually lead to millions of people in a country and the story that binds us together, we can't do that. But with the power of story and narrative, we can do it at a gigantic level and usually forget that those are social realities at all. In other words, that they're invented.
Yeah, that we think that this is the way it's always been, when that can't be true.
Yeah, it's the way it's always been. It's the only way it could be. So I love that you wanted to transfer us into sort of the corporate realm because obviously that's you teach a whole array of subjects, whether it's creativity and the like. So any of those things we can touch on, we will. But how that applies to people who are either entrepreneurs in businesses starting things or even in their day-to-day business as a worker, all of those things apply because there is a narrative surrounding us. And how do I deal with that in a better way today?
Yeah, challenging narratives is one thing, but like for entrepreneurship, having a narrative to enact is everything. Like we're now finding out when people's products or ventures are more successful, it's because the story is compelling. And people talk about leadership. I mean, that's not new to entrepreneurship. People talk about leadership as the distinguishing factor of transformational leaders is that they have a compelling vision that people buy into. Well, how do you get people to buy into a vision best? Have them co-create it. So when everyone on your team, your organization or group gets together and you create a vision of where you want to go, like what's the goal going to be, and then narrate how you're going to get there, then you have an actual set of a goal and how it's going to happen, and you just work on enacting that. So when I said a team is highly coordinated, it's because they're literally all trying to enact the same story. So they think, through my actions, how can I bring this story to fruition? So if I had a goal of losing weight, I could think, what is the story of me? What's going to lead to me losing 10 pounds? Well, it's probably going to make some dietary changes. Here's what I'm going to eat in the morning. Here's what I'm going to exercise more, or take long or walk every day or do yoga, whatever it is. But I have this plan. And if I actually do that, then that goal will come to fruition. So it's not rocket science. In fact, it's the way that we've managed our lives forever, but we're just not intentional about it because we have this taken for granted story, this idea that narratives are often taken for granted. So we're not good at questioning them, and we're even less adept at creating them.
Hey, everybody. Just a quick reminder that Smarter You Media is brought to you by the Alderson Griffin Center for Family Business and Entrepreneurship at the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. Just Google Alderson Griffin Center. Come and discover all the great programs we have out there for free and help us help you build your dream. You know, James Clear in the book Atomic Habits, another just fantastic book, he gives the example of two people trying to quit smoking. One of them, when asked, do you want a cigarette, says, I'm trying to quit. The other one says, no, I don't smoke. And the difference in that perspective is profound because instead of just the narrative for yourself, literally being the thing that you want to be or knowing what you want to be is an incredibly powerful part of the equation.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is a relation between a narrative and someone's identity. Because the stories, a lot of people say we're nothing more than a collection of the stories explaining what's happened to us so we become a victim or we become a champion, or we're a smoker trying not to be, or I'm not a smoker. That's my how I identify. So if I'm not a smoker, I don't do things like smoke.
And it becomes a bit of that self-fulfilling prophecy. So when you let's go back to the creation, the entrepreneur. I mean, there we certainly have talked to and will talk to entrepreneurs. You know that that's something that I did. We had a powerful narrative, and what you just articulated was exactly how the World Poker Tour became this global phenomenon. It was a great story, and it was enticing enough that everyone wanted to write about it. So we didn't have to do a lot of PR. We just did earned media where we were being written about because it became a thing.
That's really nice. But, and I want to say that it's not just for the story as a presentation to outsiders, but there's also the guide for ourselves of
Yep.
what actions am I going to take to bring this to fruition? So I want to ask you actually if internally you said, here's our plan is to achieve this. And then, I mean, and here's the details for how any company or organization or person could do it. You think, here's what I want to achieve. And then here are the steps that I'm going to achieve that. So you'll identify needs along the way, like, oh, I'm going to need a master's degree. I'm going to need someone who knows a software developer. I'm going to need this. So you identify for yourself everything it takes to get there. And then you plot it out how it's going to happen. And it's like a script for you. And then you just go by the script. And if you manage to enact that script, that goal will come to fruition. So it's a really powerful guide. And the other thing I wanted to say about being highly coordinated, if everyone in the team co-creates this narrative, then you don't have to ask what they're doing if they're in the field or something, because like a character in a story, if you have favorite characters in books, you can kind of predict how they're going to act in certain situations. Well, it's really powerful in organizations if you can predict what your team member would do because you would do that too in their situation because you know their character from a narrative that you co-created.
Yeah, and it's rather special when it works and when you have a group of people who are on the same page with the same narrative and story. It's wildly powerful.
And you don't have to get them on the same page because they created it
Yeah,
together. And
yeah.
so you've got high commitment and highly coordinated.
Yeah, I feel like that's exactly the case, and it doesn't always stay that way. There's a little bit of a Camelot effect that, when you're early in a startup that has people creating together, that doesn't always feel like a company that has hundreds or thousands of employees because it's more fractured, though good leaders find a way to continue to empower the narrative creation from the bottom up, like you're talking about.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned fracture because that's not a deal breaker for narratives. So imagine a family business is really distinct because it has multiple goals. It has a profit motive and then like a family succession or some other aims. Now, when was the last good book you read that didn't have tension in it? And
Right.
if that tension gets resolved on page two, you've got yourself a boring book. So the thing that narrative can do is it doesn't have to resolve tension before moving forward. In fact, it needs the tension to move forward. So you need multiple viewpoints to drive the story forward. So you can have multiple goals, and if you can still write them into a narrative, you get to keep those different threads in your story. Now, imagine the opposite. Traditional thinking is that if we're going to have a strategy, we have to resolve all these different viewpoints, or we have to pick one way. That's not true in a narrative. You actually need the tension as a driver to move the plot forward. So you can have multiple goals that you're enacting, and a narrative can hold those without having a compulsion to resolve them.
Yeah, that's a good thing because I don't imagine that it would be possible ever again in a diverse and large institution to do that. So it's good. It's good that it can work.
That's often when we're seized, when we think we're in a big company, we haven't decided whether we want to pursue this goal or this goal. So we have to resolve that before we can act because they're thinking there's only one path. But a narrative is a bit broader. So it's not that you can go in all different directions. You still have to co-create a narrative. But someone could be achieving for example, a social aim if they want to make a contribution, like a social entrepreneurship as well as a profit one, and tell the story about how they're going to be profitable and make a contribution. And you don't have to resolve those or decide which way we're going to go before we start.
Yeah, again, I don't know if you, again, if you wait to start, you never get started. It's the Achilles and the tortoise.
Uh,
You're, you're in Zeno's paradox, baby.
or information. I was working with Clorox one time, and they were talking about brand narratives for individual brands. But one thing that struck me when I was with their executive team, and someone said that they are drowning information. So they collect all this consumer information and they know everything about us. So they said when you pull up your social media, you get one of 12 ads for the same product. And if you're a mom, you get a mom oriented ad. And if you're another set, if you're a grandparent, you get it, or if you're single, you get another ad selling you in a different way. So they have all this kind of information on you. But he said, we are drowning in information and starving for decisions. And that's what companies face. We always have the excuse that we need to collect more information before we start. And sometimes your best information comes from starting quickly, and then you rapidly respond to the information that start creates.
Is there a dark side on the other side? So, as you study narratives, where this is positive, you and I tend to be very positive people. So, it's not surprising to me that we sort of start on the good side of that. On the other hand, if we don't find a place where we can agree on what would be sort of underlying narratives at some point, it can have a detrimental effect. Yes?
Well, yeah, if you go by a narrative that someone else wrote and it benefits them, then you're enacting a narrative that benefits someone else. So this is a dark side. You can create a narrative that controls behaviors and actions of others. So we have this, and this is a complicated subject, but we have this narrative in the US called the glass ceiling, where women and minorities don't advance above a particular level in organizations. So if I'm a female in middle management and I believe that there's a glass ceiling and I see a position open up upper management, I say, oh, there's a glass ceiling, I'm not going to apply. Well, my question to you is how many jobs do you get that you don't apply for? None of them. So there you are. And this is not Professor Hansen saying it's women's fault they're not in upper management. I'm saying there's a tendency for us to go by a narrative that says, don't apply because you won't get the job. And then you don't apply and then you don't get the job. So that it has that self-fulfilling prophecy if you're not conscious that, hey, I'm not going to go by that narrative that's controlling me. So it cuts both ways. The benefit of that we can create the narratives we go by allows us to be empowered and have more agency in our own lives, but also deconstructing or not going by narratives that exist like, oh, there's a glass ceiling, don't apply. Well, then you're doing half of the work for people who built the glass ceiling. That if you simply recreate it through your actions, if you keep reenacting the glass ceiling, it will always exist.
Right. I would say that when we buy someone else's narrative that does the opposite, it disempowers us, then we're disempowered. That would make sense.
Yeah.
Uh, I do think that what I was trying to get at the dark side was a little bit different, which is more. There have certainly been hires, people I have hired in companies that turned out, I thought, to be a great fit, but their motivation was so outside of what we really wanted in terms of building community that it became a real challenge, and eventually had to get rid of those people because their way of approaching interactions was not within the culture as we were trying to build, honestly, a culture of support.
Yeah, well, that is a tough thing to identify, and I always say, don't ask people. You can also share with them, and like so. There's nothing more powerful for a group of people than to have a shared understanding or a shared vision. So that's culture. Is the definition of culture is shared understandings. By telling them, here's what we want to become, and do you see a role for yourself, and actually give them a role in that story to enact. And they can also decide, because it's very hard to say, here's what we're trying to accomplish in bullet points. Just like the boy who cried wolf, if we get the bullet points, it is not as memorable or impactful. But if you share with people your story and think about, are you attracted to that? They might self-select in or out of that instead of you having to find out later because you're thinking, we were trying to create this, this, and this, and you're not a match, but you weren't able to identify that, or companies aren't able to identify that because they have a bullet point instead of a narrative. and people don't see their role in the story, they're not going to be part of your story. So this is like being inclusive for all kinds of perspectives and talents, and that if they don't see a role in the story, they're not going to enact it. So find people to either make or create or include them in the story about, and this is not pursuing their own goals, but like, how does your knowledge, skills, and ability lead to us achieving this or bringing this goal to fruition? And then they can kind of craft their own way. I mean, that's very empowering to think about, how am I going to play a role in making your story come true? But I've got to know your story before I can even contemplate that.
Yeah.
Sure.
And in the storytelling, so I come from a world of television and film, so storytelling is close to my heart. So the narrative impact that we have, not just in our own mind, but in the sort of broader culture, come at us every day. There's now an infinite amount of streaming material. There's now, always stories of all kinds coming at us. What kind of impact do you think that has on the change that is our life today? It seems different to me that when stories were much more collective or limited. Now it's sort of this barrage every day of story.
Yeah, you're painting a picture of a really fractured story scene, where there's that it's hard to align people. I kind of think that when you talk about your history, and I had this done with one company, they brought a person in to create storyboards for how they were going to move through their narrative or their different brands or how their products were going to do well. In that case, it was a consumer products company, but they had this storyboard portion, and to have it out there physically. So first of all, the story gets like implicit assumptions out on the table, but to have storyboards laid out was an incredible tool. So they
Yeah.
had storyboards and they could shift them or add scenes, and they really thought about how they were going to achieve this goal. So the goal was collective. So this is the real thing that story does. So everybody can have the same goal and then implicitly have 10 different ways to get there.
Yeah.
So when you have 8 to 12 people get in a room and think about, we're going to have to tell the same story to get to our achievement or how we're going to achieve the success, all of a sudden you start to see there's a lot to resolve. I mean, just a day long meeting or a story workshop, a narrative workshop, really gets a lot of understanding out on the table, because you start to see what you're talking about. This fractured world becomes a more unified thing of, even, and nobody has to give up their own aspirations and goals and autonomy.
Right.
It's just how does my role fit into the story? So you actually get a larger role in the story, but to see the people on a team have to resolve things and start to agree on a path would not have been evident if they didn't try to storyboard and create a narrative of what's going to happen next and what's the next scene going to be for our company or our family business. And they start to see that, and then they think about what happens in that scene. Well, instead of just saying, okay, we're going to be number one in customer service in our region, it's, well, what does that mean? What steps does that mean? It means that if a customer calls, they
Yeah.
get a contact
Yeah.
back every day by 5 p.m. If a customer asks for this, here's what we do. So everyone knows the plays. So when they're out in the field and a customer does have an inquiry, they know just what to do. There's no, let me get back to you. They've already decided, when this comes up, here's how we'll act, because they have this narrative to guide their actions.
That sounds powerful. Uh, how does that translate into our own personal lives, right? So within a corporate community, we're in communities every day, whether it's at home with family or everywhere else. Does the planning help there too?
Yeah, I think it hashes out a lot, because I think I'm very goal oriented, but not very plan oriented often. So I have a goal, but I don't know how I'm going to get there. I just have some goal. So my actions are kind of unrooted. So if I lay out the steps of, well, here's what it's going to mean, I then actually know what to do. I have a narrative, like I'll keep saying this, it has to be tangible enough to be enactable. So it has to be, and I know we have this buzz term already, actionable, but I like enacting as the verb, because I have to know, what am I going to do to bring the story to fruition. So the creation of your narrative is part of the planning process, and it can reveal a lot in a company.
Yeah. 100%. Well, I love that, and I know you teach creativity in entrepreneurship and in business. This is one of the cornerstones of that. Are there other pieces of it that sort of fit into me being more creative when I'm in my workplace?
There is, I want to say that a narrative is, it really gets everyone on the same page, but there's a flexibility there. So a
Yeah.
lot of companies have to pivot because they see an opportunity that doesn't align, but a narrative, I think less pivots are required. You can just pursue opportunities without a major change. And you can you can see opportunities and make decisions based on your narrative about whether or not to pursue them. So sometimes pivots, for example, in entrepreneurship are externally or because of some kind of negative event or a threat or a regulation happens and you realize you're not going to be able to sell your product in this market. But often it's through opportunity. And out of all the opportunities available, it helps you make decisions on what's going to help our narrative come to fruition. So it allows you that flexibility to pursue things, especially if it's going to help you, you know, enact your narrative. And I think that having it means it's kind of like a jazz, more loosely framed, where uh, bumps in the road or opportunities don't bring you to a halt because inherent in your story is how you would respond to that. So I think there's a lot of rules about creativity and innovation in there that are also inherent to narratives. And in fact, narrative is a creative act, but also allows us to creatively respond because if we have a very regimented plan and something doesn't go according to the plan is out the window. But I don't think narrative has as much vulnerability of having to be thrown out the window.
Because it continues and you can pivot, but you're still within the broader narrative at some level.
Yeah, and you can even think about your organizational identity as a character of saying, what would they do if they were presented with this opportunity? And you can think about how would we act if this came up, especially when it is coming up, and just try to remain in character and true to your vision and true to your story.
I think that's powerful stuff, Mr. Hansen, Dr. Hansen. That's pretty awesome. Well, we always try to end by making all of our audience better curators of information in the land of information. As you said, there's data everywhere and it's overwhelming us. How do we find the good stuff? So I know you've come with a thought in mind for something that you found along the way that was helpful, is helpful for you to be better at finding good information.
Well, I want to one up you because this was my information source, but I want to encourage your audience because there's stuff we haven't thought of, and I'm always seeking influence and ideas. I want people who hear this to tell me some way that they've used a narrative, or if they experiment and think of something that can inform me, I would love to hear because we are not the end all do all of information, and I want to hear from people out there who've tried it or who want or are interested in narrative or had some experience with it to tell me. So if I could beg of your audience to inform me, I know I'm kind of giving you a reverse card there, but
No,
I
that's
want to
brilliant.
encourage engagement with the audience. So I would love to hear from people who have had experience with narratives or had companies that have tried out kind of more narrative like tactics and tell me how it went. I would love to hear.
Well, I love that. And I will have you give the book title again. But Dr. Hans Hansen is findable. You can find him at Rawls College of Business. And you see the book right there in front of you. Dude, it's really great to see you. Thank you for your time. That was really lovely.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you. See, everybody, we'll see you next time.